when you are going after that like growth at all cost mentality, there's so much harm and inequity that gets perpetuated in that cycle. So figuring out like, are there ways to circumvent that? And so, I mean, sure, maybe sometimes they're like impact investors or investors that are really looking for things that are aligned with social good or furthering something like that. But I also think just like helping folks figure out like, how can you do this sustainably and get as far as you possibly can without having to accept that outside influence that could potentially be detrimental if it is focused on that growth at all costs mentality.
Okay, Stefanie Monge, so nice to meet you and welcome to Seed Money. Great to have you here today. How you doing?
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here and chat with you today.
Yay, yes. So you have such an awesome background. Currently the editor of Silicon Prairie News, which I have to admit I had not heard of, and I love it because the whole reason I'm doing this podcast is I feel like when I was, starting my entrepreneurship journey, everything's about Silicon Valley, and you feel like if you don't live there, you're totally missing out. And
Right.
it can be very intimidating, actually. So I absolutely love that you guys kind of have adopted and just are charging your own path in the Midwest and in Nebraska. So tell me a little bit about, I would just love to start with like, what are you seeing, as entrepreneurship trends there? What's happening there? What are you writing about these days?
Sure. So, I mean, for somebody who lives on the coast, they might not expect that we have quite a bit of traction in the startup and entrepreneurship community here in Nebraska. So I've actually worked with entrepreneurs specifically starting in Nebraska in the late 2000s. And it was around the time of the Great Recession. And it was a time where there really started to be a shift in terms of folks' views of what it meant to take a risk, or what they were really willing to kind of gamble in terms of like their career and their livelihood. Here in Omaha, where I'm based in Nebraska, we have Mutual of Omaha, we have large insurance companies, financial institutions. And when folks thought about like what it meant to have a promising or fruitful career, fulfilling career in Omaha, Nebraska, I would say like 15 or 20 years ago, that definitely meant go to one of these large companies, find that long-term security, and a place that you would essentially spend your career. And so I would say like startups, entrepreneurship wasn't really so much what people thought was happening here, or even what folks thought would be possible in a place in the middle of the country, because we are really right in the middle of the country. I would say over the course of the last 15 to 20 years, that has just transformed dramatically. And I would say all the way from the universities offering entrepreneurship degrees, having venture funds that are actually run by university students, those types of things, getting folks interested at an earlier stage has really led to this just like explosion of companies that are starting interesting businesses, many of them solving practical problems that they faced themselves like in their lives and careers.
Wow, that is so cool. Yeah, it is funny, like thinking back. I don't know. I don't remember in college anyone talking about entrepreneurship at all.
Me either. Like
it was like not talked about.
Yeah, that's it. Like I tell people all the time, I graduated in 2007 and went right into journalism as a newspaper reporter, writing about business and entrepreneurship. in that first, year or so was just not even a word that was in my vocabulary, let alone something that I had considered studying or exploring like through college or university or any other time.
Isn't that amazing? Yeah. And I look at kids nowadays, like even, 7, 8 years old, they know what that means. It's very
Right.
cool. So I love that. And I love the idea, again, just going back to it real quick, like it doesn't matter where you live. You know what I mean? It just matters how resourceful you are. And, just kind of having that make it happen attitude. What are you seeing there in terms of like early stage companies that are starting out? Are they self-funding to get to a certain point? Like, what are you kind of seeing as the trend for when people go out and raise that first round?
Yeah, so honestly, it really varies widely. That like, grit, like you mentioned, that just kind of like willingness to make things happen. I think in the Midwest, in Nebraska, folks are kind of used to just rolling your sleeves up and getting the job done, kind of whatever that requires. We hear a lot of folks talk about that Midwestern work ethic and that resourcefulness that really kind of encourages folks to start and then kind of see that process through in terms of starting a company. In Nebraska, we are really fortunate. We have state like programs that support entrepreneurship through grant matching funds that can be pretty significant, up to like $150,000 in matching funds. So that is actually administered through the Department of Economic Development here. And there are a lot of public private partnerships. So, like different ways that I see companies being funded. For sure, through those matching grant programs. And so maybe they're raising a friends and family round or investing some of their own resources and then putting that capital up to be matched by one of these grant programs. We have resources through like the Nebraska Business Development Center, the SBA, where folks are again accessing like small business innovation and research grants through SPA or SBA through the STTR, like small business technology transfer. So those are some options that we're seeing. We have over the last few years really increased the number of early stage investors and investment funds that exist in Nebraska, really specifically for that like pre-seed and seed stage entrepreneur. Move Venture Capital is one that started at the beginning of last year, so the beginning of 2023 in Nebraska. And they have made huge inroads in terms of even just writing small check sizes, starting at like $25,000 to like help folks validate their ideas, understand like what they need to do in terms of connecting with like a technical co-founder or building their initial prototype, things like that. And then I would also say we have a firm here called Proven Ventures, like revenue-based financing is also something that we're seeing folks at that kind of early stage. If they have customers, if they are generating revenue, potentially through starting off bootstrapping, that are able to then leverage that to access more capital to help them just like grow and get to the next stage.
Wow, that is so cool. Yeah, I think it's interesting with that pre-seed stage because that is the most intimidating time. It's hard to find a mentor. It's hard to find advisors who will even like help you. If you get a little bit of traction or just can validate that idea, even just building out your kind of support team of advisors can be so much easier. And then that can lead to connections and like figuring out how to make it happen, right? But if somebody has an idea, yeah, typically it requires some amount of funding, a small amount, and that can be the hardest. And if you don't have, friends and family that are, if you don't have the track record or whatever it is, who are willing to give you that money, that's very, very cool. I didn't realize that was happening. That's really awesome because that's a huge, like, that is the the catalyst right there is just getting that idea validated at the beginning.
Absolutely. And I mean, I would say in terms of like starting a company in Nebraska, especially compared to like, let's say San Francisco or Boston or Austin or New York City or any of these kind of larger metropolitan areas. On the one hand, Omaha, we are about 1 million people in the metro area. So it isn't a small town. On the other hand, the cost of living and cost of doing business is still dramatically lower here than some of those other places. So a smaller check or a smaller amount of startup capital can definitely go a lot longer here than it would necessarily in other places. And so that is one advantage when we talk to founders who decide to stay here, because we're seeing that more and more. Like I would say, in 2010, 2012, 2015, even, there were folks who really felt like they needed to leave Omaha or leave Lincoln or wherever they are in Nebraska to be able to be closer to customers, investors, that network of potential advisors that you mentioned, just resources in general. And we're seeing that turn around now, where folks are recognizing the value in staying in Nebraska and also recognizing just the plethora of resources that have been flooding the ecosystem. I would say really specifically over the last sort of 10 to 12 years, that mean that there are folks who have had successful exits here who are now on to building their second or their third SaaS startup. And I guess one other thing I wanted to mention, specifically about Nebraska, we have a really active syndicate of angel investors here. So the Nebraska Angels are in Nebraska a very well-known group of investors who can be a really great resource for those early stage founders. I will say something that is culturally a little bit different from other places I've lived and worked in, Silicon Valley, for instance, is that the angels here, they tend to come in actually at a later stage and are looking for more traction than for sure the angels like I know from my network in San Francisco. So it's interesting. The angels here are important and operate a little bit differently than what I've experienced in sort of other regions of the country.
Interesting. Why do you any ideas on why? I wonder?
I think it's just still that like leftover cultural aversion to risk.
Okay.
And I think also here, like a lot of people have built their wealth through real estate investing, and that still is like a lucrative and more known. It is a more familiar way
Yeah.
to deploy that capital and expect that return. So besides educating founders on the resources that are available here, there's also an effort among existing investors to attract other accredited investors, even if it's just at an angel level, but like trying to understand that not only can you potentially get a return on your financial investment, but that you are furthering economic opportunity and development, potentially creating jobs with that investment in a way that is really special and I think does appeal to certain folks.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. Yeah, we all know you definitely have some heavy hitters in Nebraska.
Yeah, right. Yeah, you might have heard of Warren
Yeah,
Buffett.
yeah. So I'm sure, yeah, there's motivation to reinvest and grow the area and kind of keep it growing and maturing in terms of a business hub, and so that's
Absolutely.
very
Yeah.
cool. And I think that's such an advantage too. Like people do. I could see what you're saying about Silicon Valley being different, where people are just like, oh, I'll just try this, I'll try that, and whatever, we'll see what happens. Whereas there, it might be a little bit more like, okay, we're really doing this to, for a purpose to kind of help help the entrepreneurship community, and also really make sure some of these companies do actually grow and flourish here. So that makes sense.
And I would just say, I would just describe it as calculated risk. Like that really, it's just like there is just a higher level of calculation when folks are considering the risks associated with either starting or funding an early stage business here.
Yeah, that makes sense. Very cool. That's amazing. Um, let's talk. Oh, actually, one more question on that. And then I want to hear a little bit more about your background too. But are you seeing, so, in terms of entrepreneurs there, are they mostly people who are from there, born and raised there? Are you seeing people now actually go there because the cost of living is so ridiculous on the coast? And if there are resources like that, and I mean, you're an entrepreneur and you're kind of scrappy and in that mode anyway, that could be very attractive to move to a place with a lower cost of living that still has resources and a community around entrepreneurship. So what are you seeing kind of there?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I would see not so much folks who are moving to Nebraska who have never been here, who are seeking this out as the place they want to start a business necessarily. More so boomerangers. So, like folks who are from the area originally who left either to start a business or just to live their lives for whatever reason and are recognizing that coming back to Nebraska makes a lot of sense for them, whether it's because of their support network or cost of living or the resources that are becoming available now that were not available before. We are seeing more and more folks who are, I would say, coming back and then also deciding to stay here instead of feeling like, even they've got to move to Chicago to be close to just like a larger community of VCs or investors.
Very cool. That makes sense. That totally makes sense. Yeah, I
And who
think
knows? Maybe we'll get there. Maybe
yeah,
there will
totally.
be a day when Nebraska is the entrepreneurial mecca of the Midwest.
Yeah, well, and especially if the prices keep going up
Right, right,
like
right.
they are here. Let's quickly talk about, or not quickly, but you have a consulting firm also, which sounds fascinating. And I saw one thing where you said you have a focus on equity, belonging, and human-centered design. And my idea of that, I love what I'm thinking, but I'd love to hear from you. What does that mean? And obviously that must play a part in kind of pieces that you're writing as well as, how you're consulting entrepreneurs. So tell us a little bit about your philosophy there. And uh,
Yeah. So I really see entrepreneurship as a potential means to help folks build generational wealth, to further economic development and economic opportunity, especially for folks who have come from historically excluded backgrounds. The reality is, most of us are not going to get filthy rich at our day job. Like that, just like working for someone else, there is just a cap in terms of how lucrative that can be. So really helping folks to understand like how they can harness their own sort of like innate abilities combined with like their interests and the things and really their values. So it's like, what are you naturally really good at? What do you care about? And like, what is your purpose and what aligns with your values? And figuring out a way to kind of determine the intersection of those different areas to figure out what is a sustainable path forward in terms of starting or building a business. I think that with venture backed startups, and I mean, I'm like, I cringe as I'm about to say this, but it is what I believe and what I have experienced. When you are going after that like growth at all cost mentality, there's so much harm and inequity that gets perpetuated in that cycle. So figuring out like, are there ways to circumvent that? And so, I mean, sure, maybe sometimes through like impact investors or investors that are really looking for things that are aligned with social good or furthering something like that. But I also think just like helping folks figure out like how can you do this sustainably and get as far as you possibly can without having to accept that outside influence that could potentially be detrimental if it is focused on that growth at all cost mentality. So that's one part of it. And then I would say something very related is just like the hustle culture. I mean, this like idea of I'll sleep when I'm dead. Well, no. I think that like again back to that idea of sustainability, figuring out like we can't just pretend we're machines. Like we have to bring in that humanity, like our humanity, and like whatever it is we're like building, designing. Um, if we're not thinking about the humanity of it, then I just kind of feel like by default, we're just going to perpetuate harm. And so I think it's just a more intentional approach to figuring out how you can really bring all those things together, but also recognizing that doesn't mean like you're a nonprofit or that you have to be a social impact business or that you aren't, profitable. Like that doesn't mean that you don't want to make money. It just means that you're thinking about it and probably kind of going about the process in a slightly different way.
Yeah, that is, I think, all of that I am so aligned with. And it's funny, like, as we're talking, reflecting on, almost 20 years ago and how we weren't even talking about entrepreneurship. Like, I hope 20 years from now, my son, if he's, when he's in his 20s, is like, remember when people, I don't know, but remember when that people would just kill themselves for their startups, it's
Right,
like,
right,
and get so burnt out. Like if that can shift over time, I think it would just be incredible. Cause I do think also, I don't know how many people actually don't start their own business because they do feel like it's all or nothing,
right, right.
possibly. And I think even the other thing too, like, I totally agree with you in terms of working a day job versus, having a path to wealth. And it doesn't even have to be the idea of getting filthy wealthy,
Right,
right? It's
right.
like, it's just having, I think, who knows where we're going to be 20 years from now, but even a day job might not be enough to even sustain your life like in
Sure.
retirement, right? So I think
Hmm.
entrepreneurship is even a path just to have more control over your future. And also just some peace of knowing no matter what, I can figure something out. It just builds that resourcefulness in you to be able to not be afraid of starting a new business when you're
Right.
60 or 70 or you know what I mean? And not
Hmm.
being so reliant on just that job and that paycheck. So yeah, I totally agree with that.
Yeah, and I mean, and I like the idea of, taking control of your financial future destiny. And I also think the way I think about it is it's like it's freedom. It's financial freedom in terms of not worrying about where your resources are coming from, but also like the freedom to make the choices that align with your life and to make the choices in how you spend your time and your energy. I think all of that also becomes something that is a really compelling attractor for folks who are interested in pursuing that entrepreneurial journey, because you're right, it's really hard and it can be really worth it at the same time. So
Yeah, totally. So how do you work with entrepreneurs right now? What's your like, are you working with early stage or kind of what point are you working with people and how are you helping?
yeah. So right now, since I am the editor of Silicon Prairie News and startups are all that we write about and entrepreneurs, I end up working with folks outside of Nebraska just to avoid a conflict of interest.
Oh, got it. Yeah.
So the way that I work with teams and entrepreneurs now, I specialize in working with women entrepreneurs and at stages starting from the idea stage. So maybe you just have like the inkling of an idea and you need help thinking through your business model and plan or projections or things like that. But then also I work with folks all the way up to that growth stage. I've had a lot of experience working in startups that are going from seed to series A. So that really just like streamlining, figuring out how we're going to make this something that is lasting instead of fleeting. And again, too, with that like process on bringing the humanity into it, thinking about equity, thinking about belonging, there are a lot of opportunities to put in process and like systems at the beginning that ensure as the company grows and scales that those things can be built into the system versus an afterthought. So I work with them through retreats, through workshops, through one-on-one coaching, is a lot of kind of historically. And then I am not actively doing this right now, but I have in the past produced conferences for specifically for women entrepreneurs at various stages, because I do think there is a lot of value in bringing folks together who are maybe a little further than where you are, who are a little behind where you are, to really learn from one another's experience. Um, and also, I think just to like help boost morale, to find other people who are doing something similar to what you're doing and can just like, remind you like, you've got this, like, you've got this. We're going to do this. It's going to be all right.
That's amazing. I love that. In terms of kind of, setting yourself up at the beginning for having, not going for burnout, basically, what kinds of things do you suggest to people to evaluate? Like, what aspects of the business do you find most effective to kind of streamline early on?
Honestly, I would say the biggest thing is I am I'll use the word strict, but boundaries between like work time and non-work time, and when you are communicating, and like what the expectations are for communication outside of work hours. Like, that is one thing that I really emphasize with my team and also with other founders, because I have been on that team where I'm getting slacks at 1 a.m. and emails and texts and all the things, and where the expectation is like that I respond in real time, or like within a certain time period, or even if I'm not expected to respond, like, well, I've noticed that you sent me this email at 11 p.m. and now I'm just going to for sure think about it until I respond or go to bed or whatever. So I think that like being intentional about how and when we communicate with teams, and like what our team members and like what those expectations are, I think is just kind of like table stakes in terms of creating that environment where folks can find a sustainable way, versus feeling like the expectation is like you are on 24 hours a day and we expect you to be responsive anytime that you're reached out to.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, I agree with that. Although I'm definitely guilty. I am the person who's like emailing at 11, like, but don't respond. Don't feel like you have
Right.
to respond. But it's
Okay.
like, yeah, of course you're thinking about that.
So here's my trick for this, because I also would be like, well, I'm gonna send this, but I'm gonna say like, but I don't expect a response. And honestly, what I have started doing is I just schedule it to go in the morning.
Oh,
So
that's a good idea.
so it's like with Gmail or even Slack, it's like, great, I'm gonna write this thing right now because I'm thinking about it, but I'm going to schedule it to be delivered at 8 or 9 tomorrow, which feels like a more appropriate time for you to get that message. And then it guarantees that, the person on the receiving end isn't like, well, but maybe I should respond, or thinking about their answer while they're laying in bed. So,
Oh my God, I love that. Yeah, because I think it is, as much as even as the entrepreneur, you want to have, balance and boundaries. There are times when that is not easy to follow. But it is so important. Like, you can't have the expectation that your team is, or I believe your team shouldn't have to work as hard as you do. I mean, unless they're a majority owner, have major equity in the company. So I love that. Great tip. That is a good idea. Very cool. Okay. I want to quickly talk about women specifically, because obviously I'm one. And we've got, I've been doing this podcast now since May. I think maybe you're the second female.
wow.
No, maybe, third, I think. But anyway, mostly guys, just kind of naturally in this startup space, right? So, I guess just any thoughts on that? Like, my perspective was always that I'm going to look at it as an advantage because I'm going to stand out and I'm going to be, the woman who is going for it. And there's 20 guys standing over here in the pitch competition, but I don't care because I'm going to be, blah, blah, blah. So I think it can be an advantage, but there's obviously, and I would imagine in the Midwest, there's a lot of traditional cultural stuff around that as well. So I don't know, what are your thoughts on, female, women, raising money, all that good stuff?
Yeah. Okay. So I've got many thoughts. Thank you for asking these questions. First of all, I will say that like initially, so again, let's say like 15 years ago, kind of the beginning of the startup community becoming like a thing in Omaha and like Lincoln specifically, the two largest cities in Nebraska that are just an hour apart. I for sure, like I would be the only woman in the room. I would be the only person of color. I would definitely be the only woman of color around many white men because that was just like who was in that space initially. Coming back to work with Nebraska startups when I became the editor of SPN at the beginning of last year, the thing that was the most surprising to me was the diversity that I was seeing in the community, and not just in terms of um, founders, but also investors. We have some really significant venture capitalists and also angel investors who are women who have a lot of influence in the community in Nebraska. There are women who are immigrants who are starting businesses, starting high tech, venture backed businesses in Nebraska. I I just yeah, like it is interesting and it is pretty exceptional, just like the level of diversity that has developed and like I couldn't tell you why. Like I don't have a good answer in terms of why. Um, but I will say because it does kind of feel like we have hit this like critical mass of like women in the ecosystem. It's just like when we or I go to different startup events, like it's incredible just like the women who know each other, who are part of, accelerator cohorts. So it's just like there, I think that it's like if you can see it, you can be it. And I mean, I don't, yeah, I mean, it's like, it's true. I don't love saying it, but it's like, well, it's true. So I think that just like the number of women that are already active, that are already succeeding, that are willing to help one another, kind of like through the process, whether it's through like making intros or giving advice, that I think has made it feel like a very welcoming environment for women. I do not have the specific I don't have the specific data in terms of fundraising. I know there's a gulf though. I mean, because when I think about the companies that I know of here locally who have, raised a series A or the funding announcements that I have coming through right now, for sure, in terms of dollar amounts, men are getting more investment. And I can also think of a couple of like women led companies or women led startups, even an ag tech startup that has like raised funding in the last year. So it's interesting. Like it's interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think it's still I love that there's more women who are the angels who are running the VCs, starting the VCs and that kind of thing. I think that's so important. I know my very first, angel investor was a woman CEO of a
Mm-hmm.
huge company. And that was such a pivotal thing for me. It wasn't just getting the money from her. It was like, this woman believes in me. She's
Right.
badass, such an amazing role model, so there's just so much to that, which is so cool. Yeah, that's amazing. I think that's great to hear that even there, it's like just diversifying more and more and more. It's not the age old, what you expect to see a bunch of, white haired older people is kind of the stereotype. That is very cool. I love it. Well, this is so great. Anything else, any advice you have for just kind of people going out there, raising that first round, thinking about raising that first round of funding?
Yeah. So, something that I'm seeing more of here locally is CDFIs, so Community Development Funding Institutions. They are essentially lending institutions that have less rigorous lending standards than like a traditional bank. So they're an alternative means of potentially accessing capital to start your business. And that is definitely something I've seen happening more. Something I mentioned earlier, revenue based financing as an opportunity, looking for grants, even through like federal grants, like again through like the SBIR, STTR programs. Um, just thinking about the different opportunities to access capital that don't necessarily have to be a venture capitalist. And I also would just say, like, continuing to bootstrap as long as you can. And ideally finding customers who can, even if it's a pilot customer, who can help like with infusing that capital while you're also learning, building, getting feedback, iterating on whatever it is that you're putting out into the world. Those are just some things that I would encourage folks to do as they're just starting out and thinking about what their resource needs are to start a company.
Yeah, I love that because I think another fear that people have is I don't want to give up my
Right.
whole company. I'm like, I don't want to, all of a sudden someone else is running the show. And with so many other resources out there, whether they're state funded or city or, um, just banks have alternative programs
Yeah.
like you're talking about. I think doing the research to find out all those options, it can be so worthwhile.
Well, and I think too, just like understanding what are the potential pros and cons of those different approaches. And to your point, what is important to you? Like, if the thing that is important to you is retaining as much ownership as possible, then maybe that means you're going a little bit slower or thinking about, alternative sources of funding. And if your goal is to get as big as possible as fast as you can, then the reality is venture capital is the way to go. It's a way to do that. So I think too, there's a level of evaluating, is this the type of company and am I a type of founder who wants to go this way? Or, what matters to me, and thinking about that as you make your funding decisions. And one more thing that I was thinking about is it's just like, don't get discouraged by the number of no's that you will hear. I talk to founders on a regular basis who are in the process of fundraising or who have just finished fundraising or they're just starting fundraising. And like the thing that they all have in common is they've heard so many no's. So I think just like preparing yourself that that's just part of the process. Every no is like one answer closer to finding that yes. So even as quickly as you can get to that no, it's better for you. It's better for you, for the investor. Don't take it personally. Just like take the no, keep going. But like don't feel like you can't send those no's, future investor updates, if you want. And I've definitely heard from folks who, they had someone who told them no initially. They were just like low key, just still keeping them in the loop with investor updates. And then in a subsequent round, they did decide to become an investor. So you're going to get lots of no's. Some of those no's might at some point turn into a yes. But like most of it doesn't have to do with you. So that it's just like not taking that personally. There are just so many other factors and so many great ideas too that I've seen not get funding because it was not the right time or not the right location, or just there's so many different factors. So I think that is really just back to that like gritty part of just remembering that, like, okay, um just keep going. Like that is really, it's just like, how do you keep going, but again in a way that is sustainable, and making sure that you're not sacrificing your well-being for that. But
Yep. Thick skin. Put on your new outfit of thick skin.
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's crazy. I think the worst is getting no answer. Like I always used to love getting a no because at least I knew. But when you just get left hanging, that's when it's like, yeah, no, I love that. And it is, especially at that early stage with angel investors, if you are talking to individuals, like, their life might just be busy at that
Right.
moment, but 6
Right.
months, they might be like, ooh, I've got this cash. I need to do
Yeah.
something with it, before the end of the year, whatever, who knows? So yeah, I think that's great advice. Well, wonderful. Thank you so much, Stephanie. This is your wealth of knowledge. Where, if someone does want to work with you, because I think what you're doing and having a thought partner to sit down and strategically think through what kind of funding path do I want to go down, that aligns with who I am and my business model. That can be so important to do in that early stage. I made that mistake.
Yeah.
I didn't do that. And I think also, and just sounds like you have so much great experience. So yeah, where can people learn more about you and what you're doing and all that good stuff?
Yeah, I would say LinkedIn is really the best place to connect with me. My personal LinkedIn, it's my name, Stefanie Monge, Stephanie with an F. But yeah, LinkedIn is a great place to reach out. And I would love to connect with anyone who's interested in having a conversation along those lines.
Yeah. Perfect. Okay, we'll put that in the show notes, your LinkedIn. Amazing. So nice to meet you. Thank you so
nice
much.
To meet you too. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Take
Bye-bye.
care. Bye.